Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll continue our deep dive into the story of the Doughboys on the Western Front. From the continuation of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, we'll explore the fighting as it intensified and take a look at two famous actions: the story of the Lost Battalion and Corporal Alvin York's remarkable Medal of Honor actions. Oh, hello again, Dan, as we continue our study of the Doughboys on the Western Front, and I feel like we've been on a journey with the American Expeditionary Force from its somewhat hesitant beginnings, its training and so forth, through some of its more famous victories, in fact, Belleau Wood, the Rock of the Marne and so on. And Meuse-Argonne, of course, we were discussed last week. We had discussed the first day, and as you made really clear in that podcast, it's the biggest battle in American history. In terms of numbers involved, it's the bloodiest battle in American history, and we couldn't do it justice without including at least one more episode.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to be part two. We're going to be looking really from day two to the middle, I think 2/3 of the way through the battle today. Is we've really got probably two more episodes to go. This one and one more to round off our story of Doughboys on the Western Front. But it's, as you say, Spence, it's been a fascinating journey. I've really enjoyed it. And I think it's worth at this point just to recap where we left things when we go back to the end of the last episode. If you're not watching you're listening to these back to back, we need to just think back to that very first day at the end of September 1918 when the Doughboys went over the top. It was a very bloody but generally successful opening day. And I do say generally because that's really the watchword here. Just to reset the scene in terms of the geography, imagine three kind of vertical strips running side by side northwards, with Verdun on the edge of the right-hand strip, which is where the Meuse River runs, also south-northwards, right over to the left, about 35, 40 kilometres until we reach the Argonne Forest, which is the left side of the advance. And we're going to have three American corps who are going to be advancing almost directly northwards towards the German-held town of Metz. And on that opening day, of course, the big plan was a 16-kilometre advance, Spence. Can you imagine that kind of number when we talk about any advance during the Great War?
It gives credence to what we've been discussing with us, that the French see something of their army in 1914 and the Americans, the British see something of their army in 1915. Tremendous ambition. Tremendous determination to restore mobility to the deadlocked Western Front. And listeners, if you've been following along with us in this set within the series, you'll know that this was an overriding doctrinal idea of the Americans, that the Western Front had got bogged down, not because of technology, not because of barbed wire, but because of a lack of aggression from the British and the French. And the Americans were there to restore aggression and in return restore mobility. And so a 16-kilometre advance, that's beyond even the most ambitious dreams of the British and the French, really from 1916 onwards. But to the Americans, it makes perfect sense. And of course, it chimes in with their past experience. They've had a very rapid advance during the Second Battle of the Marne. They've advanced rapidly at Saint-Mihiel. But as we said last week, this time it's a different type of battle. It's in difficult terrain, and it's not open warfare anymore. Now they're attacking into fixed German defences that have been there for years. They've built these defences up very carefully over a number of years. The American army's never encountered anything like this on this scale. And it's a day of mixed fortunes, the opening of the battle on the 26th of September. You have an enormous opening barrage that seems to, in fact, it does do some damage to the Germans. US divisions step off and advance, but they're moving through difficult terrain. It's muddy. They lose their creeping barrage, which is going too fast and disappears into the distance. They run into dozens, hundreds even, of concealed German positions which engage them. And a number of US divisions are really stopped in their tracks. 79th, 28th Keystone, 37th Buckeye, they all fail to take their day one objectives. And it's a bit of a rude shock after the success of Saint-Mihiel. That said, as you say, Dan, in places, the advance is actually pretty impressive. 4th Division, for example, takes about 10 kilometres of ground. And so mixed fortunes, really, with the assault. Pershing is not overwhelmingly discouraged by this. You knew it was going to be a pretty hard fight. Not everything's gone according to plan, but he has made advances. There's been heavy casualties on that first day as well, but it's quite clear this battle is going to continue, and Pershing wants to really exploit the success that he has gained. And above all else, what he wants to do is he wants to pinch out this German cornerstone, if you will, of their defences, which is the very heavily fortified German position in Montfaucon.
Yeah, and Montfaucon is going to be the focus. Strangely, actually, it's the focus of the Americans really pre-battle. But unusually, 5th Corps, who've been given the job of taking that, are the least experienced corps that the AEF are bringing to the opening day of the Meuse-Argonne. All 3 of the divisions that are going to be assaulting here are completely green, not seen any action at all. And what a baptism of fire that's going to be. So just to recap before we get stuck into the Montfaucon story, so we've got on the right-hand side the Meuse River Valley. That's where the rightermost corps of the AEF are going to be assaulting. Generally, progress here is pretty good, but we have to bear in mind, progress here isn't meant to be breakthrough. This really is a flank guard at the moment. There will be French attacks to the right, to the east of the Meuse later on, but at the moment, there's no real plan other than to screen the centre and the left of the assault. But there is success here. Pretty impressive, down to the river. And what's also important to remember, though, is that the heights of the Meuse beyond have not been taken. These are going to play a key part in the battle to come. In the centre, we'll come back to that in just a moment when we focus on the story of Montfaucon. But on the left on that opening day is when we see real problems. And understandably, we touched on this last time, the Argonne Forest is a real issue. Whereas the 16-kilometre advance is planned for the opening day of that assault, it's not planned to go 16 kilometres in the Meuse-Argonne, but it is planned to go some distance. Actually, we find about a 1 kilometre advance, and it's a very, very bloody one as well. What we really want to focus on, though, as we get to day 2 and we push forward to this story, Spence, is the idea of getting around Montfaucon. And I think we could start off with what we touched on lightly last time, which is a real missed opportunity. And that comes in the form of what 4th Division could have done when it comes to the assault.
We see this so often in the First World War. We see it in the Second World War too. And this is in complex, bloody battles. Sometimes opportunities are lost, which could have saved thousands of casualties in the future. And 4th Division's experience is much like this. Because as we've mentioned, the assault, particularly in the center of the assault, got a lot of inexperienced, completely green US divisions who've not gone through the extended in-France training either. So they've only got their training in the US to draw upon, fighting in very difficult terrain against a determined enemy. Lots and lots of things go wrong. And the 4th Division, which is of a bit of a higher standard than these green divisions, is the one division that can possibly unlock this position on day 1, makes a deep advance, has an opportunity to actually outflank Montfaucon, turn the flank, open that very, very tough nut up, possibly unhinge the German defences. But it doesn't take it. And the reason it doesn't take it, we did discuss last episode, but what it boils down to is inexperience. Because although 4th Division is more experienced than the other divisions that are stopped in their attacks, it's still an inexperienced formation. Inexperienced in command, inexperienced on the ground, its staff officers are inexperienced. It just doesn't have that level that you'd find in a more battle-hardened army that understands the nature of the Western Front. And this is by no means a uniquely American phenomenon. You can look at things on the Battle of the Somme. You can look at things even in 1918 where opportunities are missed by experienced British and French divisions. But given how important Montfaucon's going to be and how many lives are going to be lost storming it, you can't help but look at 4th Division and say, oh, if only. But it's very easy for us to say a century later. At the time, even though 4th Division's made this big advance, the level of confusion within 4th Division is high. It's strung out, as inevitably is the case when you've made a big advance. Its flanks aren't completely secure. There's some uncertainty about exactly where things are on the flanks. It's taking some localized German counterattacks. There's going to have to be a big leapfrog forward. They've got to bring their supplies up, their artillery up and things. There's a lot of complexities weighing on the commanders of 4th Division. Perhaps we're being a bit harsh to say, they made a mistake because there's a lot of exterior factors. And there's a phrase I like to use that although their mistake may not be excusable, it certainly is explainable.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. And of course, there is what we discussed briefly last time as well, the idea as well that this This may even come from the very top of the command tree, with Pershing creating or fostering an environment of competition between his corps commanders, and the idea of one corps commander not necessarily wanting to support another. And of course, Montfaucon lies across the corps boundary from 4th Division, who are to the east of it. So it's not within their corps boundary. So whether they turned left or could have turned left and outflanked the Montfaucon position, of course, we'll never know. But what's really interesting is that this place is going to be taken. It's also going to be taken by the flank, but from the other side. Now, I think maybe just to clarify here, Spence, because we've mentioned Montfaucon a number of times, and I don't know that we've actually explained exactly what this position looks like. We've heard it's a hilltop position. It's very strong. You kind of get an idea, picture in my mind here of machine guns sitting at the top of a hill. It's actually not hugely dissimilar to that. Montfaucon itself is actually a small village, and it's down in fairly low ground. So when we talk about Montfaucon, we don't really mean the village. What we mean is the high ground to its slight northeast. This is where an old 12th century abbey sits, and all around this hillock really are sighted German guns, German bunkers, German positions. In fact, if you ever get a chance to go to Montfaucon and the incredible Montfaucon Memorial there, the remains of that church still stand at the top of the hill. And one thing that always sticks in my mind when I go up there is a German bunker which was built inside the church, and it was concealed inside the church and stayed that way until the Allies conveniently knocked the walls down around the church. Then all of a sudden a 2-story, so with a set of stairs, 2-story observation bunker which had been looking over the whole site, not observed by the Allies, becomes clear. So going up there today, you see it's an uphill fight against established German positions with plenty of barbed wire. It's the same old story, particularly now when you throw green units into it. They get repulsed on the first day. In fact, 79th Div, who are going to be leading that assault, are going to become combat ineffective within just a couple of days of the battle starting. And the vast majority of those casualties are sustained in and around Montfaucon. But it is going to fall, Spence, and it's going to fall by an attack from the division to the left, who are going to turn right once they've reached their own objectives and assault, again, a very bloody assault up the slopes. And this is where we come to just sheer American determination and courage. They are going to fight their way through, eventually opening up the door from Montfaucon, clearing the abbey, or the ruins of the church. I forget if it's a church or an abbey now, but clearing that area. And at that point, they can now look down northwards towards their distant objectives that for the next 3+ weeks, they're going to be fighting through, again, at very heavy cost. It's a remarkable moment. And what it ultimately does is it allows the progress of the battle to continue. And really, from this point, we switch kind of focus, much like we did last time, back to the left again. This is the area of probably, strangely, Spence, actually, the Argonne Forest, probably the hardest place to advance down, next to the Aire River Valley, which, at least in terms of terrain, is one of the easiest. And this is where we're going to see the idea of what's ultimately going to become the Lost Battalion. But before that happens, just give us an idea what the fighting in the Argonne Forest itself was like at that time.
Well, this is really, really grim stuff. And just to sort of take a step back and add some weight to what you've said about the fall of Montfaucon, listeners, it's worth just really getting across that this is taking place over several days. We may have given the impression, or I may have given the impression, that this all happens on day 2. So day 1's gone off, we discussed that. Then between the 26th of September and the 1st of October, there's really this swirling fight. The Americans are trying to push forward. They're getting fixed on Montfaucon. They're fighting in the forests. And it's really grueling, bloody fighting. And the Germans are not willing to give ground. In fact, the Germans actually reinforce themselves on the 29th of September and are able to launch a major counterattack. And this is the first time, really, the Americans have suffered something that the Germans are famous for, these deadly ripostes that hit you as an attacker. You've stormed a position, you're in the German position, and you think, okay, we've got it. You've suffered casualties, you're tired, and then suddenly what are called Eingriff troops, specialist counterattack troops, hit you. There's usually a big gas bombardment hits you as well. And 35th Santa Fe Division on the 29th gets absolutely hammered by a large-scale German counterattack that really mauls it. In fact, the Germans break through part of 35th Division and push basically back to the gun line of 35th Division and get stopped by this ad hoc group which has got engineers, some machine gunners, and basically a gun line of artillerymen, which includes Harry Truman. It's a moment of quite severe danger, and Your 35th Division is so badly smashed by this counterattack. That's it. It's combat ineffective. It's out of the battle. And bear in mind, these are big divisions, 20,000 plus. And the fighting, but really between the 26th and the 1st, is not going the Americans' way. They're smashing their heads against these very, very tough obstacles. It leads Pershing actually to admit we are no longer engaged in a maneuver for the pinching out of a salient, but are necessarily committed, generally speaking, to a direct frontal attack against strong, hostile positions, fully manned by a determined enemy. And this is an acknowledgement. This is a really intense fight. And in fact, on the 1st of October, Pershing actually stops the offensive for a time. Its divisions are chewed up, everyone's jumbled, and the rear areas are in total chaos as well. There's terrible traffic jams behind the American lines. Lots and lots of problems there. So he needs 3 days to sort this out. It's interesting to reflect, if this wasn't late 1918, the Germans would almost certainly have taken advantage of this to counterattack again. If this was the German army of 16, the Americans are very precariously perched here. They could have been hit again. But it's not, of course. This is a much weaker German army, albeit one that's still got its teeth. And after those 3 days of regrouping, on the 4th of October, the US Army goes again. And this time, Pershing's rotated in basically 3 of his best divisions, the 1st, the 3rd, and the 32nd. It's more experienced units. It's more emphasis on combined arms. The Germans as well have suffered casualties. They have suffered in this fighting. It has been by no means universally one-sided. And although the German resistance is still tenacious, they start to be overrun. Lots and lots of bitter close-range fighting. Montfaucon falls during a period of very intense fighting between the 14th and the 17th of October. But even then, there's still very, very heavy casualties. 79th Division attacks Montfaucon frontally, and one of the officers who was in the front line remembered that the artillery coordination was so poor on this assault that it was the equivalent of asking, and he quote, our men to storm a fortress with our bare hands alone. And in fact, the 79th sacrifice at the gates of Montfaucon earns them the nickname Cross of Lorraine, which the US Infantry Division still bears. So very, very bitter, intense fighting. And even when Montfaucon falls on the 17th of October, you've still got, as you said, Dan, US units are locked into a dense forest, the Argonne forest. And nature of forest fighting, whether it's the 21st century, the 20th, the 19th, the 18th century, is always the same. Very, very limited sight lines, a really intense feeling of claustrophobia, point-blank engagements, and hazards in the First World War that aren't unique to the First World War, but the nature of the fighting adds weight to them. So airbursts in the tree canopy, which splinters wood, rains deadly shards of wood down onto you. Trees catching fire. Now, although that doesn't happen so much because it's so wet during Meuse-Argonne, it still happens. Gas release into the forests and mustard gas release in parts of the forest, which basically makes it completely uninhabitable. Again, reduces the sight lines if you're fighting in a forest in a gas mask. And something else, which, again, not unique to the Argonne forest, but I think is really commented on by the American soldiers who survived this battle and ride home. And this is as artillery and mortar rounds plunge into the forest and there's explosions. Men are simply blown up into the branches. And in some cases, they're impaled there. Nobody's got time to get them down. They're dead. They've been killed by the blast. But the sight of reserve units are going towards the front line, and there are dead Americans and Germans trapped in the tree canopy, really disturbing. And all the letters that talk about the Argonne forest fighting, all the accounts reference this intense claustrophobia in there. You can't see, you've got no real sense of direction. Apart from the people really within arm's length of you, you're not sure where your comrades are. It's disorientating, it's frightening, it's a ghastly place to fight.
It is, and I think everything that you've just mentioned there, Spence, I think paints a picture of one thing that really becomes clear in the Meuse-Argonne, particularly the Argonne forest, and that's confusion. Losing battalions to your left, companies to your right, even losing brigades is absolutely possible. It's strangely, this happens on more than one occasion. It happens to the same guy on more than one occasion because, of course, the famous Major Charles Whittlesey, who's a battalion commander within the 77th Division, is going to be involved in this brutal slog forwards, as you say, at almost point-blank range. And a couple of days, just towards the end of September, start of October 1918, he is going to be involved in breaking through the German lines, as he's planned to do, and advancing too far and being isolated, being cut off. Now, you might think I'm preluding to the famous Lost Battalion action here. I'm actually not. This happens 2 days before he manages to extract himself, and the same thing happens again 2 days later. Whittlesey, along with this, and this, bear in mind, is during that pause period. So there are still local counterattacks going on. The aim for Whittlesey and his group of men that are going to be going forward, about 650 or so, they're going to be aiming to cut a vital rail line in a place called the Charlevoix Ravine. This is an east-west running line which goes straight through the Argonne forest and behind what is then the German lines. He's going to go forward and try and grab a section of that, hold at the base of a river and a pretty steep set of cliffs, and if he can, then join up with other units who would have advanced on his left and right hand side. Now, in this incredibly confusing environment, what he's not aware of is that he's actually found, almost by chance, a gap in the German lines. His men, about 650 of them, are going to make their way through. They're going to push on, reach their objective and settle on their objective, and then look to their left and right and realize, hang on a minute, there's nobody around us. This is going to become a major problem because actually the Germans are going to counterattack that night and close the gap that Whittlesey has advanced through. So he's now more than a kilometre behind German lines with 650 odd men. I just want to talk briefly about the name, the Lost Battalion here, which is incredibly catchy. The American press, by the way, pick up this story as it's happening. So it becomes a really big deal. The name's Lost Battalion. I think two things to mention here. One, it's not lost. Whittlesey knows where he is the whole time. And secondly, it's not a battalion. It's actually a mixture of companies from different battalions and some additional troops. It's really a conglomeration of different units. So not lost, not a battalion, but it does fight damn brave and damn hard for a period of 6-7 days. What's going to happen during that time period is the Germans, realizing that there's a breakthrough in their sector, are going to start amassing on the high ground around this kind of bowl that Whittlesey has been locked into. So he's with his 650 guys covering an area just about 200 meters long by about 300 meters wide. That's a very small area. During that time, they're going to sustain multiple attacks. So they're going to be bombarded heavily by both American artillery, which drops short and hits them and actually causes somewhere in the region of 100 casualties, staggering numbers, and regular German artillery, mortar rounds coming in, machine guns firing, particularly at the sole water feature that exists, that's absolutely vital to the survival of the men in that, what's known as the pocket. During that time, there's going to be attack after attack, including at least 2 episodes with the flamethrower. There's going to be Whittlesey desperately trying to send message back via runner to try and break through and let the Americans know where they are so that they can send a relief party. None of those runners are going to make it through. Pigeons are going to be released, including the famous last pigeon, a guy called Cher Ami, who is a dear friend in French. He's going to be set off with a message strapped to it whilst Whittlesey is actually under attack by his own artillery. The famous message reading something, I'm paraphrasing here, we're in this position, given the coordinates. We're being shelled by our own artillery. By the love of God, stop it. That Cher Ami is released, actually gets hit by a shell blast, loses an eye, a leg, and is wounded in the breast, but still takes off, flies back, and as the story goes, it's received at its home coop. The message is passed down to the artillery. The guns are stopped. In actual fact, what really happens is they realise before Cher Ami arrives that they're firing in the wrong spot and stop. But it's a nice story. We like pigeons in podcasts, so it gets included. But Spence, the whole idea of the Lost Battalion generally, and I think it shows something of the American determination to fight, of the 650 guys that go into that pocket, probably something like 100 and I forget the number now, something 100 and something, 190 odd come out. It's an incredibly costly fight. But during that 6 days, they're under sustained pressure. What's important though, as powerful as the Lost Battalion story is, with Whittlesey and 4 other men earning the Medal of Honor, with Whittlesey himself meeting a tragic end, sadly committing suicide off the back of a ship en route to Havana in Cuba in 1921, just a few years after the war. But really the story of bigger picture, the fight is actually what goes on either flank, particularly as you alluded to, Spence, the introduction of fresh divisions. 1st Division, who are going to come into the Air River Valley and replace the 35th, and also a new unit they're going to be coming in who are going to find fame in the Second World War. They're going to be the 82nd, the All-Americans. Their job is going to be to hook left and outflank the Germans still within the forest.
And this is an interesting aspect, that this is not in the original plan. That the original plan, as we've mentioned, is that 16-kilometer advance to just break through all this, go clean through it. And we can look back and go, that is tremendously ambitious. We've already discussed this. And to go through a defended forest that fast is remarkable. The idea of really hooking around this is not really to be found in the original plan. And this expansion, this change in the overall American approach is quite interesting. It does show that Pershing, who's sometimes criticized for being a bit bullheaded at Meuse-Argonne, there's certainly some grounds for this. He's under pressure. He really wants this battle to succeed. He's sometimes frustrated with what his corps commanders are doing. And his idea about hooking around the Argonne Forest is actually a good one. And he can do it because he has a lot of troops. The American army, which we've discussed, growing in size pretty much all the time. And hooking around the forest is actually a smart move. The Germans can't really deal with this additional outflank. And one of the reasons for that is, although we've emphasized Americans having a really hard time fighting through these positions, it's costing the Germans too. The Germans are suffering under American artillery and machine gun fire. More and more Germans are stuck in and around the front line. They do have cover on the flank of the Argonne Forest, but it's not enough against a fresh American division, which is going to ultimately, again, with some pretty fierce fighting, the entire battle is characterized by very fierce combat that's more or less continuous. It ultimately manages to get around the flank. And this is the idea is actually to cut off everybody in the Argonne Forest. It doesn't quite work because there is enough Germans in their way to buy time. But of course, in the midst of this hooking maneuver in the second week of October, one of the most famous actions of Meuse-Argonne is going to occur.
Absolutely, it is. And it's going to come, of course, from those new guys in the line, the 82nd. I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned a minute ago, though, and that's the fact that there are still Germans fighting in the Argonne Forest. So there's a specific reference here, which I think is one that I'd love to hear your opinion on as well, Spence, because, of course, by the end of the opening day of Meuse-Argonne, it's become incredibly clear to the Americans, to the Germans, that there's a major attack on. You can't hide this kind of assault. And whilst the Americans are pouring more infantry into the area, and they've already got, of course, a big logistics train working hard to try and keep that advance going on, the Germans are also reacting. And one of the things that they're going to do is bring in artillery batteries to the high grounds, really on either flank of those three corps. So on the left flank, into the high ground around an area known as La Chaîne Tendue, there's going to be a lot of artillery batteries. German artillery brought in 13 different batteries, and the same thing on the right flank over on the heights of the Meuse. Now, these can do some real serious damage. Not only can they reach the guys in First Corps who are attacking through the forest in the Air River Valley, but they can also reach the corps that's assaulting around Montfaucon as well. And so, just give us an idea, Spence, from with your expertise on the artillery, what effect having, for example, 13 artillery batteries able to fire into the flank of an attack might have on the battle.
Wow. Well, I mean, what an effect it has. So generally, although not always universally, generally you'll be looking at 6 guns per battery. So you're looking at over 60 guns being brought in. And there's an aspect actually to this German artillery deployment. There's 2 aspects to pick out before we even get into the effects of it. One is the Americans haven't been able to integrate tanks into their assaults in the way they want to. We heard last week about how George Patton trying to lead FT tanks, French light tanks, through this very confused, congested battlefield. He can't do it. They cannot bring their tanks into action. American tanks do see action in the Meuse-Argonne battle, but they never are able to mass and really make a difference. The terrain doesn't help. The weather conditions are poor. Combined arms is only really occurring at a local level. What that means for the Germans is, and like when they face the British and the French, who are very good at integrating tanks by now, the Germans have to put a substantial amount of their field artillery into the front line as anti-tank guns. Generally, somewhere between 20 and 25% of all of German division's artillery will be anti-tank by the autumn of 1918. With the Americans, they don't feel they have to do this. These batteries, there's just not enough American tanks really involved for the Germans to distribute anti-tank guns in the same way. So they can mass their batteries purely for the role they're intended, artillery. The second aspect is the Germans still control a significant amount of high ground, and that's really important for observation. Meuse-Argonne in some ways is defined by observation because, as we keep emphasizing, the terrain's poor, sight lines are poor. On top of that, the weather's poor, a lot of rain, a lot of squalls, so very high winds, which are massively disrupting the ability to put aircraft in the air, and certainly disrupting American reconnaissance flights. In that kind of battle, he who controls the high ground has a huge advantage because you can actually see without needing aerial assets, and the Germans can use this to their advantage. Massing these guns, which can effectively fire unimpeded because of the lack of American aerial reconnaissance, because of the weather, it's difficult for the Americans to find and fix these guns and deliver counter battery. You are adding a division's worth, more than a division's worth, of pure firepower into this. And they can fire not merely in a straight angle, but they can effectively fire in an enfilade onto you. So you're being taken from the front and from the flank. And that is especially devastating because if you imagine, listeners, you have a firing line of American riflemen spaced a few paces apart, perhaps 4 or 5 paces apart, they're engaging, and then you have shell bursts taking that line lengthways. It's very disturbing for the troops, and it's going to inflict really severe casualties. And because the Americans struggle to find these batteries, because of the reasons we've just explained, a lot of these German batteries can fire unimpeded. And they're not just firing shrapnel and high explosive, they're also dumping gas onto the Americans too, which is just adding to the misery and the difficulty of the situation. The only way you can really deal with this is to take the high ground and outflank this gun line, force them to go back. Until then, you're just going to have to grin and bear it. And American artillery does try and find the German batteries. They try and search them out, try and engage them. But it's really difficult when you don't have the weather conditions to allow large-scale use of observation balloons and large-scale reconnaissance flights. So this arrival of artillery, which can just concentrate on pounding American divisions, is a really powerful addition to the German arsenal.
It adds some credence as to why exactly we get this further assault up the Aire River Valley, which is going to result in the famous Corporal Alvin York action. So just to set the scene, we've got the Meuse-Argonne on our, the Argonne Forest, I should say, on our left, running northwards, kind of that left-hand strip of the three. And to the right edge of that is the Aire River Valley. So the Aire River running down with some fairly decent terrain. What's going to happen is as 35th Division, who have become combat ineffective, are withdrawn from the line, the famous Big Red 1st Division are going to come in. They're going to punch northwards, kind of parallel, like a set of train tracks, and they're going to drive the Germans in the Aire River Valley back. What that then allows is the 82nd Division to come in about the same position, and instead of punching northwards, they're going to swing left. They're going to cut behind the German gun line. They're going to cut behind the troops who are currently surrounding the lost battalion. And ideally, by cutting and reaching the French on the far side of the forest, they're going to create their own pocket of Germans, which can then be eradicated, including all of those vital guns. So this is what's at stake. Now, the problem is, by the time the 82nd Division, who are fresh into the line, get to a spot called Chateau Chehery, which is going to be where this main assault is going to happen, the Germans have also, because they've got nobody left to fight to their front, have also turned their machine guns left to their left, which means they're going to be facing frontally out of the forest towards the oncoming 82nd Division. This is going to lead to most of the division getting bogged down and really struggling to find a route through. But one platoon, and it's about 19 guys, in fact, it's an understrength platoon, are going to be given the job of trying to search around the southern flank and see if there's a route to get around, fix the positions of the German machine guns, maybe engage them, but it's not really envisaged with that small number of men, but rather report where they are so they can be taken out by other means. And amongst that group is going to be Corporal Alvin York. He's a fascinating character. He's full of contradictions in some senses, and I really like the story of Alvin York as a result of that. He's from a fairly unusual background. He grows up in a small town, very hard fighting man. Apparently, he's a heavy drinker. He likes to go into bars and he likes to get into scraps, and he usually wins them. Until at some point he has an epiphany. He finds religion. He denounces his former ways as being a wayward stray and a bit of a hellraiser. He gives up drink and he goes and turns himself round to really become a pacifist in some senses. He, in fact, when he's conscripted into the army, they ask on his form, does he want to fight? And he famously writes no. He's a conscientious objector. And nevertheless, he is put into the army. And as you can tell from the action to come, he does change his mind. Perhaps, and we've seen this in other situations, there are famous British characters who do the same thing, just really see the worst of war and decide that they're gonna leave their long-standing principles to one side for the duration of war, DOW. And it's gonna end up with York under a sergeant. Actually, he's not commanding; he's one of 4 NCOs within this group of 19. Working their way around the southern flank of a ravine which is harbouring dozens of German machine guns. He's actually going to find an open spot, and they're going to take on just these 19 guys, less than that, in fact, because the platoon commander is wounded. They're going to take on Germans who spot them, decide that they're of course a risk. York and his men are going to overrun an entire German regimental command post and then start knocking out machine guns to their southern flank. They're going to be faced with a bayonet charge, of which there's a little bit of conjecture here, Spence. One famous story says that York uses his 45 caliber, his Colt 45, and the famous story goes that as these 3 or 4 men are running at him, he shoots them rather than nearest to furthest. He shoots them furthest to nearest first because he doesn't want the other guys to realize they're being shot at. I don't know. I don't think that my body would allow me to shoot the guy furthest away than the guy that's 4 feet away first. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure about that. I think in that your blood up, adrenaline pumping, like your life at stake, you'd shoot your brain, your limbic brain, your reptilian brain would insist you take out your nearest threat first. But it's a great story, as so many of these sort of heroic action stories often are. And a point just to build on this is, of course, this overrunning of a German command post gives you some impression, listeners, about how close ranged this battle is, because the German command post is really surprised themselves. They think they're a bit further away from the fighting than they actually are. And command posts coming under fire in the Meuse-Argonne, be they American or German, is actually quite a common experience because the battle lines shift so rapidly and so quickly that you might think you're pretty safe in your bombed out cellar or so on, and in actual fact, the enemy is only about 50 to 100 yards away in a line of trees or behind a brick wall. But none of that takes away anything from the sheer blood and guts of this action. And for an American public at home that's keen for some good news, because the Meuse-Argonne offensive is clearly not going completely according to plan. Heavy casualties, the lost battalion incident, the lines on the maps are not moving very well. In fact, that's a comment that's actually made at the Supreme War Council, where all the Allied leadership actually is, that compared to the advances in Flanders, compared to the advances in the Somme region, and so on, the American line down at Meuse-Argonne is moving a lot slower. And that's, for the American press, is why is this happening? This doesn't look so good. The casualties are high. And Alvin York's heroics is exactly the kind of news story every good journalist wants to get his hands on.
Yeah, and it's a good point, actually, because it's perhaps we're doing York a disservice, or perhaps the story does the other men in that group of 19 a disservice, because it's not exclusively York. York plays a prominent part, apparently personally killing around 20 men during this engagement. A huge number of prisoners are taken for such a small group of men, as well as machine guns being knocked out, and the position, more importantly, being unlocked to allow that advance to continue through the forest. It's very likely that actually it's that the story is about the group generally, but press at home really they don't want a story of a brave group of men. They want a story of one brave man. They want that one individual that can be really held forth. And York is that man, and that's who they choose. He's originally awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. It's later, a few months later, upgraded to the Medal of Honor and presented by Pershing himself, who famously says something, again paraphrased, "Then Sergeant York has been promoted. I hear that you took the entire German army captured." To which he famously responds, "No, sir, only 132 of them." which is pretty good going for a small group like that. It's but the big picture here, Spence, and one that I think we need to really focus in on is the fact that this position is unlocked. It allows one, amongst others, Whittlesey and his men, the Lost Battalion, to survive. These events are almost contemporaneous. This is happening on the 8th of August, just about the time that Whittlesey is coming to the end of his siege. But a big reason for that is because the German troops in that area start to realise they're being outflanked, are going to therefore have to withdraw. So these two things are connected. And in fact, that withdrawal northwards is going to allow that movement to start to continue. And that slow and very bloody grind back through the Argonne forest northwards is going to continue on the left flank. Likewise, in the centre and on the right, the advance does continue. It's going to push on, and we're going to start to see limited but some movement. But I think one of the things that really hampers us at this point, hampers the Americans particularly, is going to be logistics. And we've spoken about this a number of times before now, but we really can't overstate it, Spence. It's such a difficult environment to operate in, and logistics is simply key to the whole story.
I know, listeners, this is probably getting a bit tedious for you by now, but one thing to emphasize is the lack of American experience at all levels, not just in the front line, where there's a lot of courage, but perhaps not a lot of tactical combined arms. It's also in the staff systems. Simply put, none of these staff officers have commanded a battle of this intensity, of this scale, and tried to manage it as well. When you add the terrain, when you add the weather on top of it, you have a recipe for disaster. And this is an aspect of Meuse-Argonne which is not really well remembered now, but is crucial at the time. In fact, it defines how Meuse-Argonne is remembered as gradually the mood begins to turn against the American experience in the late 20s into the early 1930s. And simply put, this is an almost complete collapse of the American logistics system, even given Pershing's pause in the start of October. One thing that I think might be the only occasion in modern American military history you find accounts of American soldiers excited to capture German rations because their food is not coming up to the front line. American soldiers are going hungry. They're eating their iron rations, their emergency rations. And so when they do overrun German positions, one of the first things they do is they actually loot the Germans for food. And we've heard a long time ago in our spring offensive episodes that the Germans do this with the British and the French. But the Americans to do it to the Germans gives you some idea about how short supplied they are. And it doesn't even mean, even if you're not taking ration packs from them, sometimes just capturing an area where food is being grown is a cause for success for the Americans. One veteran remembered during the mid-October fighting overrunning a defended German village, and his men discovered there was a cabbage patch, a big one, behind it. And he remembered there was a mad rush for eats, and every one of us ate the Hun cabbage as though we had captured Hindenburg himself or was indulging in beefsteak. That's how hungry the men are. And it's because logistics behind the lines have completely collapsed. There are endless traffic jams. Lorries are breaking down. Lorries are getting stuck in the mud. There is no coordination here. The ammunition has priority, as it tends to do, but they haven't put with it food. And so people aren't necessarily running out of bullets or shells, but they are running out of food. And on top of that as well, the Doughboys really need food, and in growing senses, medical attention, because it's very wet, as we've said. It gets very cold on a night. And Doughboys who are hiding in foxholes, who are in sodden, very hastily dug trenches, start suffering from dysentery at almost epidemic levels because they can't get clean water. They're actually just drinking water from shell holes. They're drinking it from grubby streams. And dysentery becomes a really massive problem. And when you've got soldiers who are genuinely hungry, they're being malnourished, they're not being fed properly, and they're drinking polluted water, dysentery can and does kill. To give you some impression about that, listeners, 82nd Division, which you've just dwelt on, all American, comes in swinging in this big flank attack that's very important. It has, in October, on average, 700 82nd Division soldiers per day are being admitted to hospital for sickness. And dysentery is the most common, with Spanish flu as the second most common. So that's a very, very high rate of attrition. When I say 700 per day, that's 700 per day in hospital. So otherwise the entire division would have been admitted by the end of the battle, just to clarify that. But it's a really serious problem. And what's making it worse is the medical evacuation chain, which is inexperienced too, is also caught up in this terrible traffic jam. the Americans haven't really accommodated for the level of casualties they're suffering. And if you remember, listeners, our episode on the wounded, by 1916, the British had got a good system, a good evacuation chain that could handle a lot of casualties. The Americans don't have that yet. There's a serious lack of personnel at regimental level, which means if you're wounded or you're sick, in fact, and you go back to your regimental post, they can't really do anything for you. They're being overwhelmed by casualties. So they say, we've got to go back to the divisional aid post. That's, in most cases, that is going to be at least 5 miles behind the lines. If you're wounded or you've got dysentery, that 5 miles can literally be a killer. And you've got to go that distance for your very first treatment. There's not even a triage system down at regimental level. So that is a harrowing journey. The evacuation chain itself is just overwhelmed by casualties, traffic jammed, and it's calculated after the battle by the Americans that it takes a casualty on average between 10 and 12 hours to reach somewhere where they're going to get their first medical treatment. That is a fatal delay. That will kill you. Even if your injury isn't severe enough to kill you, shock may well kill you. Absolutely ghastly, really, really difficult situation. And this is going on behind the lines. It's very disturbing to the troops who do go back into the rear areas. They can see and sense chaos behind the lines. And it has, sadly, Dan, a very, very deleterious effect on the men in the front line. It's bad enough to be fighting through the dense Argonne forest with all the difficulties we've discussed. Add on to the fact you're not being fed properly, and if you're wounded, your chances of actually getting proper medical treatment are low. The American army's under strain like it's probably never seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. And to give that a little bit of context, just to give a few numbers here. So by the end of the first week of the fight, the US Army has lost 6,500 dead. Number of those killed in action, number of those died of wounds because, as you say, they really struggled to get through that casualty evacuation chain to get treatment at that crucial moment. But in addition, they've had a further 26,000 wounded. These are numbers that the AEF simply hasn't seen before. So it's no great surprise that they don't have the infrastructure to deal with this kind of numbers. But there's another number I think we need to add in here, Spence, as well. And it's one that I think is quite often overlooked. And that's the idea of stragglers, in inverted commas. That's people who don't necessarily feel super inclined after, a week or two of, let's face it, absolutely brutal fighting through either a forest or through river valleys against a very determined and well-entrenched enemy. And estimates are really quite shocking in this event. And that's to say that somewhere in the region of 10% of the entire American force engaged in the battle are going to be in some way, shape or form, not engaged in the battle. It might be the old classic line, and we see this a lot throughout the Great War and even throughout wars before history. Your mate gets wounded, 2 or 3 or perhaps 4 of you might bring him back to an aid station and then loiter a little bit around there, take your time to go back towards the front lines. Bear in mind, there's no, as you've just said, there's no food up there. If you get wounded yourself, you've got to go through a pretty hellish experience to get back there. You've got horrible weather conditions. You've got a very high chance of getting pinged by something with artillery firing left, right, and centre. And so, actually, it's added to the numbers of very high Spanish flu numbers at this time. Probably even a bit of trench foot, which we really haven't even seen since 1914, 1915 in the British and French armies. The Americans haven't really experienced a very wet and cold winter like this before. So you've got these numbers that aren't necessarily casualties, but are no longer combat effective, or at least no longer in combat. This is going to mean these big, heavy, of course, well-manned American divisions are soaking incredible punishment. And as a result, the forward momentum is starting to slow. This is going to be a problem, and it's going to really lead to an even more attritional battle than we might have seen in the first place.
It is, and I'm really glad you brought up the straggling issue because, again, so much of this comes from just lack of American experience on battles of this scale, combined with the problems you've just laid out. No food, difficult medical treatment, horrible conditions. I'm glad you mentioned trench foot because it's wet, especially through October. There's just this constant fine rain that is falling, and it goes very cold at night. And because the troops are sort of fighting in forests, fighting in fields, lots of foxholes, these foxholes get flooded. There's nothing you can do. You're wet in them. Trench foot becomes a serious problem again. And all this is contributing to straggling. If we're being really generous about straggling, we can say it does include some men who simply can't get up to the front line because of these huge traffic jams and problems behind the lines. But the vast majority of stragglers are going to be men who, for whatever reason, aren't really being involved in the battle. 1 in 10 of all the American forces. And this estimate actually comes from Major General Liggett himself, who believed there were about 100,000 Americans behind the lines, not where they were supposed to be. And I say it comes from an experience. The British and the French had both experienced problems with stragglers, and great pen portrait there, Dan, of a man gets wounded and 4 of his mates take him back. And you might say, well, that's a very nice act, you'd want your friends to take you back. But then those 4 friends sort of hang around the aid post a little bit. They go a bit further back with their wounded comrade. Oh, well, it's getting dark now. We won't bother going back to the front line. It happens. You also have in battle, even in a battle where the lines are very fixed, like the early First World War battles, men can be disorientated and they wander in the wrong direction and they're not sure where they are. And the British and the French and the Germans had experienced straggling behind the lines. But all those armies had introduced what were called stoppers. And these stoppers were basically groups of military police. And they would find you and they would turn you around and they'd point you in the right direction. That may be, not necessarily what you want when you're trying to fall back subtly from the front, but they were there to make sure to round up people who'd been separated from the units, get them back to the front line. And it was really important work. In fact, it was the primary battle duty of the military police of the European armies. And the Americans do have military police, but they don't have them in sufficient numbers, and they don't have these stopper units either. And so as men drift away from their units and start to mill about behind the rear areas, there's nobody to round them up and start pushing them forward. And in the nature of the Meuse-Argonne fighting, where you've got forests, you've got ruined villages, you've got scattered positions, there's not an obviously continuous front line. It's really easy as an American to go missing in this. Just disappear into a quiet part of the forest, and as long as you've got some food, you'll be okay. Disappear into some ruined village some distance behind lines. Hang around with a supply wagon and just, pass time. And it's a serious problem because as well as it's reducing your combat strength, it's also adding to all this confusion behind the lines. These men are getting in the way. They shouldn't be here. They should be doing something pretty useful. And the Americans have to take extreme measures to solve this. They form the brilliantly named Hobo Barrage. And a hobo barrage is a mixture of military police and reserve troops who form pretty rough, tough gangs. It has to be said. These guys aren't really going to ask too many questions. Small groups, perhaps 50 or so, maybe smaller, and they comb the rear areas and round up stragglers. And some of these stragglers don't really want to be rounded up, and they have to be, forced almost at the point of the bayonet back to their units. There's some physical confrontations. There's some brawling here. And this could have been prevented if the Americans had actually had stopper units pre-formed, but they don't, because they don't have that experience. So the hobo barrages have to clean people up and get them to the front line, and it takes up a lot of manpower. By the 18th of October, US 5th Corps has 4,500 men purely in the hobo barrage system to round up men who are straggling. A huge proportion of your manpower is trying to round up the rest of your manpower. And Pershing would like to prosecute the stragglers and potentially even shoot a few of them for desertion and cowardice. But the battle's so intense and the fighting so confused, just doesn't have time to actually do this. But there are punishments actually assigned to particularly officers who are caught straggling. So, for example, in First Corps, if you're an officer who gets rounded up by the hobo barrage, you're forced to wear a placard, which in bright red letters says, "Straggler from the front line," in all capitals. And I certainly, if you made a British officer do that, or even a French officer or German officer do that, the reaction would have been absolutely furious. This is really humiliating to force your officers to wear this. But it doesn't seem to have made a lot of difference. And by the 2nd of November, in the final stage of the battle, the US Provost Marshal of 2nd Army, he actually admits in writing that straggling is so severe that it was, and I quote, "a menace to the success of the operation." That's how bad it has become. You've got inexperienced units, not that well trained, in an incredibly difficult battle. They're being asked to do too much. There aren't sufficient rotations because of this supply line chaos that's blocking everybody. You've got lots of casualties amongst officers and NCOs, which is reducing discipline overall. You've got a German propaganda effort. There's a heavy aerial leaflet campaign against the Americans. The Americans are very dismissive of this at the time, but given the scale of straggling, we might suggest that these leaflets were suggesting to the Americans, look, it's interesting actually the tone of them. Some of these say, look, the war's basically over, you're being wasted here, why keep fighting us? Take a break. And an awful lot of Americans do. But this is a sort of forgotten story of Meuse-Argonne, that there's 10% of the American army is not fighting, it's actively avoiding fighting. And yet, I think that the fact that 10% of the army is not in the front line, is not actively engaged for most of the battle, that really emphasizes how bloody it is for the army that is fighting. Because October, Dan, what a ghastly month for the American army.
Yeah, I mean, the entire fight just becomes this attritional slog. And we've seen this and spoken about it time and time again. But the truth is the fight has to go on. You can't just stop at this point. Bear in mind, in the broader picture, there are attacks all up and down the Western Front. The idea is to stretch the Germans to their limit, and that is happening. We can, for example, look at the continuation of the fight. So again, mid-October, this time we can have the French 17th Corps on the right flanks, on the right bank, the eastern bank of the Meuse River, and now going to make their attack up towards the heights. If you remember, artillery on the left flank of the American assault, which is going to be in the Argonne Forest, that's been knocked out. The artillery on the Meuse heights on the right hasn't been neutralized by this time. So French 17th Corps are going to make that assault. They're going to try and free up so that the movement can really restart in the center of the American line. Interestingly, within that French Corps are two American divisions. The 29th, of course, famous of the Second World War as being one of the two divisions that landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and the 33rd Divisions. Both of these guys experienced very hard fighting. And once again, we see that same old story. Some frustration between American and French units. Americans frustrated that the French units attacking alongside them are going methodically and slowly. The Americans want to push forwards. But we also see an interesting difference here. American casualty numbers on that right flank significantly higher than the French casualty numbers, which by this stage in the war, you can understand. We've spoken about it at great length, so I won't expand any more on it right now. But just an interesting example of mindset. What's very interesting, though, if you continue with the story and look at this, Pershing has got serious frustration. This guy's a thruster. He wants to drive forward. He wants to make advances. But interestingly, Spence, on the 12th of October, there's something that I don't really think anybody expects. Pershing makes a pretty important change at the very top of the American order of battle. And does it reflect some credit on him for being self-reflective in a sense?
Interesting point. So what we're referring to, listeners, is that on the 12th of October, Pershing actually removes himself from Army Command, which is a pretty rare example. I'm struggling to think of a Western Front commander, Western Front Army commander who does the same from the British, French, or Germans. Listeners, if you can think of anybody, let us know. But he does this, and he divides the AF into two separate armies, one under Hunter Liggett and a second under Robert Bullard. There's been quite a lot of analysis about why he does this. He's frustrated, but on the 12th of October, Montfaucon has still not fallen. There's still intense fighting, a lot of casualties. He's frustrated by this. He's feeling the pressure as well. He's feeling the pressure from the Supreme Allied War Council. I think he's very conscious as well that there's a bit of criticism coming behind his back around this. And it has to be said that the scale of managing this battle is probably too much for him. In the ground, and that's no criticism of. It's just that's the scale it is. Try and command an army of this size is vast, but it's a rare example, and it's given rise to some allegations that he's suffered something equivalent to a nervous breakdown, and he's had to do this because he just can't mentally cope. Personally, I don't buy into that. I think that's unfair. I think he recognizes he just can't manage this battle. And one of the reasons he actually does this is partially as a hope that it's going to make logistics easier, because you'll have distinct First Army and Second Army rear areas that are hopefully going to be discreet and carefully managed. I have to say that his ambitions to achieve that carefully management of logistics don't really come true, but an interesting step. And personally, I think it's the right move, Dan. And I don't really buy this criticism that it's Pershing failing or struggling or anything like that. But I'd be interested to know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think history kind of bears out that it is the right step because, things are really, the situation's really dire about the time this decision is made, 12th of October. Things have really slowed down. Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, actually wants to get rid of Pershing. Pershing, possibly there's some political pressure here, decides that he's going to make a different decision, splits these two armies up. So Liggett is going to take control of the western part and Bullard to the east. It's, of course, still not plain sailing, but it does at least allow for an opportunity for these guys to recommence with a new attack, which is going to take place right in the center of the line. Bear in mind the artillery on the Meuse Heights has been largely eliminated now. Artillery in the Argonne Forest also has, and it means that the new plan, come up largely by Liggett, is going to be a 3-division assault straight up the center, so north of Montfaucon, with 2 divisions actually acting really as an outflanking unit and 1 just in the center looking to pin the defenders in place. So the idea here is that we're going to have a pretty strong attack that's going to hopefully break the center of the German line and cause them, like we saw in the Argonne Forest, to withdraw or be completely annihilated. One of the key characters here that we're going to mention really is the regimental commander of the 165th Infantry Regiment of the 42nd Division, going to be involved in this fight, man by the name of Wild Bill Donovan. He is a great character if you enjoy your 20th century history at any point, really. He's actually going to earn the Medal of Honor in this action. It's going to be for going out. This is a regimental commander going out and bringing in his own wounded private soldiers and corporals off the battlefield. Not necessarily sure that's the best use of a regimental commander's time, but it's certainly damn brave. And he gets a Medal of Honor for that, amongst other things. He also, of course, goes on to pretty high office, later becoming in the Second World War the director of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which of course later becomes the CIA. Another person who fights hard here in the 42nd Division, of course, is Douglas MacArthur, who finds his own place in history in the future to come. But there is some success found, and unusually, it's actually a supporting action. It's supposed to be one of these actions to draw off enemy troops. It comes in the form of 2 divisions, the 5th and the 32nd. 32nd specifically, National Guardsmen, who find a bit like Whittlesey did, but on a much larger scale, a gap in the German lines.
And this is the nature of the battle too. We've emphasized so much about this confused, bitter fighting, close ranges, the front line shifts quickly, command posts being overrun. But even in the midst of all this brutality and hardship, that does offer opportunities in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have seen in 1916 and 1917. There is the German defense is very strong here and is in depth, but because the German army is basically exhausted, it's running out of reserves. It does mean if you can make a breakthrough, then you can unhinge this position eventually. Indeed, that's what Pershing had hoped to do on the very first day. Doesn't in the end, it takes over a month to do it. But ultimately, it's going to be 32nd Division, who are essentially a National Guard division. They're relatively well trained by the standards of the US Army. They've had better training than perhaps some of their comrades. And it's going to be them who are going to push forward and finally find a gap in the German line and start to break through this, start to pierce it. And very appropriate because the 32nd Division's insignia is a red arrow, and they will become known for breaching the Hindenburg line, breaching this German position. They'll become the Red Arrow Division as a result. And they have a good claim, can be disputed. They have a good claim for being the first American formation to breach the Hindenburg line. Now, that's slightly misleading because the real Hindenburg line, of course, is much, much further north. It's on the Somme sector. What they're really referring to is they have breached a genuine fixed piece of German defenses that has been there basically since 1914. And what's interesting to me, Dan, is once that crust, and what a crust it is, has been breached by 32nd Division, you start to see the Germans realize, I think, at this stage, and they've been fighting incredibly hard. They've been suffering in the rain. They've been suffering due to problems with air supplies. As those fixed defenses are breached, you start getting, for the first time in the battle, really significantly large numbers of German troops surrendering.
Yeah, and of course, this is going to compound any issues that the Germans have got. And probably issue number one at the very top of a long list at the moment is manpower. And surrendering troops en masse is just going to really start a domino effect, which is ultimately going to end on the 11th of November 1918, which of course isn't that far away from the time period we're talking about here. We're really at the 16th of October now, so it's less than a month before the war's going to come to an end. So getting any numbers of troops surrendering right now, the Germans have tried to prop up their defences by bringing in a much higher proportion of machine guns, particularly into their defensive networks. And so they do pack a punch in a static position. Machine guns, whilst they're mobile, they're not that mobile. And some positions, once they start getting knocked down, you're going to start having people having to abandon very quickly or surrender. And if there's one thing you don't want to be in the First World War when the enemy troops are turning up, is a machine gunner. So machine gunners are not popular by capturing troops. And so everybody does everything they can to get away from the machine gun they've been manning a few minutes ago and remove any insignia that suggests they might have had anything to do with one. Same as snipers in that sense. But we do start to see those kind of numbers of men surrendering, and it starts to make the job for the Americans easier. That being said, to get to that point on the 16th of October 1918 has meant an absolutely exponential effort by all involved. And quite simply, the American forces here are exhausted. And so, Spence, rather than really seize the opportunity, I think there's some truth to the argument. Say Americans don't have the energy to seize that opportunity. In fact, they're going to end really with a pause. That pause is going to take us from the 16th to the 31st of October, where we're going to see the Americans reset, resupply, and get ready to go again.
The American army needs a reset badly. By the end of October, First Army alone has suffered 109,000 casualties. A huge loss in October. And we've discussed previously on this set, the Americans have suffered casualties. Belleau Wood, Second Marne, and Saint-Mahela have all been costly, especially in officers and NCOs. But the scale of the casualties at Meuse-Argonne is like nothing the American army has experienced before. And as with previous American battles, fallen very heavily on officers and on NCOs, taking out your experienced men. Tragically, the casualties fall often on the bravest and the most experienced. They can't be replaced. The logistics logjam behind the lines still needs to be sorted out. The area that's been captured needs to be consolidated and prepared. The artillery has to move up down these congested, waterlogged and shell-damaged roads. There has to be a pause here, that the army can't keep going on. And what's interesting is really by the end of October, only then has the AEF achieved all of its day one objectives. So it's gone about 16 kilometers by the end of October. If you consider that was its day one objective on the 26th, I should say, of September. Wow, what a fight. And yet, it's done it. It's actually done this despite the huge losses, despite the intense casualties that have been suffered. It's going to pause, and then there's going to be a final period of fighting that's really going to take the American army to the end of the war, bring Meuse-Argonne to a conclusion, and that's going to be pretty ghastly as well. And that's, of course, what we'll be looking at as we conclude our survey of the American Expeditionary Force on the Western Front next week.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.